The wisdom opening you've developed is strong, but can be enhanced with a clearer connection to your audience's formative experiences. You know, there's a particular kind of strength that don't make much noise. The kind of strength men of my generation saw in our fathers who came through the Depression and fought in the Big War. Thomas Carter wasn't a man who went looking for trouble, but he was the sort who wouldn't sidestep it when it found him. That spring of '83, when drought had every rancher counting pennies and praying for rain, Thomas came face to face with a choice that would test not just his courage, but what kind of community Willow Creek aimed to be. The sun hadn't yet burned the morning dew off the grass when Thomas Carter heard the commotion. Johnson's boy came tearing across the boundary line between their ranches, hat gone, horse lathered. "Mr. Carter, Pa needs help." Cattle broke through the south fence. They're headed for Devil's Ravine. Thomas didn't waste breath asking questions. He whistled sharp for his horse, grabbed his rope from the porch post, and was mounted before the boy caught his breath. "Jake," he called to his ranch hand, "bring 2 men and the long ropes. Meet us at Johnson's south pasture." The ride took 12 minutes at a hard gallop. Thomas could hear the bawling before he saw them. 30 head of prime Herefords moving like a flood toward the steep-sided gully locals called Devil's Ravine. In this 4th year of drought, every rancher in the territory was running stock lean. Losing even 5 head would mean the difference between making the bank payment or falling short. Old Johnson stood at the edge of the broken fence line, trying to direct 3 hands who were more enthusiastic than skilled. The cattle, spooked by the yelling and arm-waving, moved faster toward danger. Thomas reined in beside Johnson, his voice level, despite the urgency. "Call your boys back. They're just pushing the herd faster." Johnson nodded and whistled his men back while Thomas studied the terrain. His weathered hand tapped the saddle horn twice, a habit from 30 years working cattle, as he calculated angles and movement. "We need to turn the leaders, not chase from behind," he said, not raising his voice, but somehow cutting through the chaos. "Johnson, take your best roper and get ahead on the north side. Don't get in front. Stay at their eye line. I'll take the south. When Jake arrives with my boys, we'll funnel them back toward the broken fence." His plan laid out in 20 seconds, Thomas spurred his horse around the perimeter of the herd. The animal responded to the slightest pressure of his knees, cutting hard when needed, moving like an extension of the man. When Jake arrived with the other hands, Thomas directed them with hand signals honed through seasons of roundups. His weathered hands worked the rope with practiced ease, decades of muscle memory making complex movements look simple. When he dropped a loop around the lead steer's horns, he didn't jerk the animal, but guided it with steady pressure, turning the leaders back from the ravine's edge. Within 20 minutes, the entire herd was milling in a tight circle, crisis averted. Johnson nodded his thanks without unnecessary words. Between men who'd weathered 30 years of droughts and blizzards together, gratitude didn't need explaining. Saturday morning found Willow Creek's general store busy with ranchers and townfolk stocking up for the week. Thomas entered, stamping trail dust from his boots, and conversation momentarily hushed. Folks naturally made space at the counter when Thomas approached, not from fear, but a quiet respect. "Morning, Thomas." Perkins, the storekeeper, greeted him. "Your order's ready. Added that barbed wire you asked for." Thomas nodded. "Appreciate it. Need coffee and salt, too." As Perkins tallied the items, Thomas noticed Widow Jenkins at the far end of the counter, quietly setting aside items as the price climbed beyond her means. Without drawing attention, he caught Perkins' eye and nodded slightly toward her account book. "Put Mrs. Jenkins' items on my tab," he said quietly, "and add a sack of flour and coffee." Perkins understood. No use embarrassing a proud woman when her late husband's pension was running late again. The arrangement wasn't charity, just neighbors looking after their own. Prices being what they are, Thomas, I reckon we'll all be eating more beans than beef this winter, Elder Wilson remarked, joining him at the counter. Way of things in drought years, Thomas replied. Lord provides one way or another. The church elder studied him. Meant to thank you for fixing that leak in the church roof. Pastor mentioned you wouldn't take payment. Thomas shifted uncomfortably at the recognition. Needed fixing is all. A young ranch hand, barely 20, hovered nearby until Thomas acknowledged him with a nod. Mr. Carter, sir, the young man began, wondering if you might have work. Been let go from the Miller place. They're cutting back. Thomas considered the lean times ahead. He'd been planning to reduce his own crew, not add to it, but he recognized the steady look in the young man's eyes. Can you ride fence from sunup to sundown without complaint? Yes, sir, and I'm handy with tools. Thomas nodded. Be at my place Monday at dawn. Pay's fair, but not generous till the drought breaks. Thank you, sir. You won't regret it. As Thomas loaded his supplies, Sheriff Hawkins approached, his weathered face creased with concern. Thomas, got a minute? They stepped outside, away from curious ears. Bank's putting pressure on folks behind on loans, Hawkins said, keeping his voice low. Henderson was asking which ranches might go under first. Thomas frowned. Your daddy wore that badge 40 years. Ever think he'd see the day when the law served the banks more than the people? Hawkins sighed, fingering the star his father had passed down. Times are changing, Thomas. Just wanted you to know. They parted with a handshake, both men understanding that in Willow Creek, a man's worth wasn't measured by his account at the bank, but by how he conducted himself when times got hard. The creek that gave Willow Creek its name had shrunk to a trickle by August. Thomas rode the southern boundary of his property every third day, checking water levels. Cattle could get mired in mud searching for water, and a rancher couldn't afford losses in a drought year. This particular morning carried a strange heaviness that had nothing to do with the cloudless sky. Thomas had learned to trust such feelings. They'd saved his hide more than once over the years. The sun was high when he rounded the bend where old cottonwoods still clung to life along the creek bed. His horse snorted, ears pricked forward. Thomas went still, hand moving instinctively to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Then he saw her, a half-drowned figure sprawled on the creek bank. Thomas dismounted in one fluid motion, approaching cautiously. A young woman, hardly more than a girl, her clothes soaked and torn, lay unconscious. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. He checked her breathing first, then pulse, methodical even in emergency. Finding both, he spoke quietly, though he doubted she could hear. Miss, can you hear me? No response. Thomas removed his coat and wrapped it around her without hesitation, modesty, and warmth addressed in one motion. Only then did he notice the pattern of bruises on her arms. Finger marks, days old, layered over older marks. Something in the pattern of those bruises told a story Thomas had seen before, and his jaw tightened just a fraction. Memories from 30 years back threatened to surface. His mother's eyes downcast, his father's belt hanging on the wall, a silent threat. Thomas had been 12 when he'd stepped between them the first time. The beating he'd taken had been worth it. He pushed the memories away. This girl needed help now. Gathering her carefully, Thomas lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, supporting her limp form against his chest. The ride back to the ranch was slow, every jolt of the horse drawing a pained breath from the unconscious girl. Jake saw them coming and ran to meet them. "Boss, what happened?" "Found her by the creek," Thomas said, his voice level despite the storm brewing inside him. "Fetch Doc Williams. And Jake, keep this quiet for now." As Jake rode for town, Thomas carried the girl into the house, something he hadn't built telling him this was no chance encounter. This was the beginning of something that would test what kind of man he'd become in his 58 years. 3 days passed before the girl, Emily, she'd finally told them, could sit up without wincing. Doc Williams had noted the pattern of injuries: broken ribs, healing alongside fresh ones, a shoulder that had been dislocated more than once, burns on her forearms that weren't from cooking accidents, no matter what she claimed. Thomas kept his distance, letting his housekeeper, Mrs. Gunderson, tend to the girl. He'd seen that haunted look before. Too much attention from a man, any man, would only deepen her fear. The morning brought clear skies and the distant sound of horses approaching. Thomas was mending tack on the front porch when Sheriff Hawkins rode up, accompanied by a well-dressed man Thomas didn't recognize. "Morning, Thomas," the sheriff said, his usual friendly tone strained. The stranger dismounted with the awkward movements of a man who'd spent more time behind a desk than on a horse. His clothes had once been fine, but showed signs of hard wear, poorly disguised. Frayed cuffs turned in, boots polished over cracks. His face carried the ruddy complexion of a drinker, with cold eyes that calculated everything they saw. "This here's Jack Turner," Hawkins said, discomfort evident. "He's come about the girl." Turner stepped forward, extending a hand Thomas didn't take. "Appreciate you looking after my stepdaughter, Mr. Carter," Turner said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Emily's been unwell, prone to running off, making up stories. Her mother's passing hit her hard." Thomas set aside the bridle he'd been repairing, his movements unhurried. "That's so." Turner reached into his coat and produced folded papers. "I have documents here. Marriage certificate to her mother, God rest her soul. Territorial guardianship papers for Emily until she's 21 or married." He extended them toward Thomas with the confidence of a man used to paperwork settling matters. Thomas glanced at the papers without taking them. "Seems to me those marks on her weren't made by grief." Turner's smile tightened. "Girls her age can be dramatic. She fell from a horse, then ran off before the doctor could see her properly." Sheriff Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. "Thomas, I've seen the papers. They're county stamped and legal." Thomas rose slowly to his full height, no threat in his movement, but a quiet authority in his stance. "Those papers might be county stamped, but they don't override what these eyes have seen." Turner's facade cracked slightly, irritation seeping through. "Now see here, Carter, I'm not asking. That girl is legally under my protection until she's of age. I've been patient, understanding you meant well, but she's coming home today." Thomas didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone made both men tense. "Mr. Turner, I ain't in the habit of interfering in family matters, but I'm even less in the habit of sending folks back to places where they got those kinds of marks." Turner took a step forward, forgetting himself. "You're a stubborn old fool. Do you know who I am? My brother-in-law sits on the bank board that holds your mortgage." The sheriff placed a restraining hand on Turner's arm. "Now, Thomas, you know I've got to uphold what's legal, even when it don't sit right." As if summoned by the tension, Emily appeared in the doorway. When she saw Turner, her face went white, hands gripping the doorframe to stay upright. That reaction told Thomas everything he needed to know. After Turner left, promising to return with reinforcements, Sheriff Hawkins lingered. The two men moved to the side of the house, out of Emily's hearing. "You're putting yourself in a tight spot, Thomas," Hawkins said, removing his hat and wiping his brow. "Territorial law gives him clear guardianship. Judge Phillips will back those papers." Thomas leaned against the porch post, eyes on the distant mountains. "Bill, what happened to your daddy's way of upholding the law? Remember how he used to say, a law ain't worth the paper it's written on if it causes more harm than good?" The sheriff winced. 40 years, a lawman's son, 20 wearing the badge himself, and Hawkins still measured himself against his father's legacy. "Times are different now, Thomas. Everything's coming down from territorial officials, banks pulling strings with politicians. A man can't just follow his conscience like in the old days." Thomas studied his old friend. "Way I see it, Bill, there's what's legal on paper and what's right by God's measure. Sometimes a man's got to choose which one he'll answer to come Judgment Day." Hawkins lowered his voice. "Turner wasn't exaggerating about his connections. Been asking around since I got his complaint yesterday. He was a respectable rancher before the '78 bank collapse took everything but his bitterness. Married the girl's mother a year back. Then she died under circumstances folks whisper about, but nobody investigated. And now he's using the girl to settle debts," Thomas said flatly. Hawkins nodded grimly. "You know the bank's looking for any excuse to call in loans with the drought. Turner's brother-in-law being on the board won't help your case none. They could take everything you've built these 30 years. Thomas watched a hawk circling overhead, patient in its hunting. "Never claimed to be a wealthy man, but I reckon I can still afford to look myself in the mirror come morning." The sheriff sighed, settling his hat back on his head. "He'll be back by noon tomorrow, Thomas, bringing Henderson from the bank and probably the Johnston brothers. They've been working as hired muscle since losing their place." "I appreciate the warning, Bill." As Hawkins mounted up, he hesitated. "My badge says I've got to stand with what's legal tomorrow, but just so you know, my daddy would have stood with you." Thomas nodded, the weight of what was coming settling on his shoulders. Some fights came looking for a man, and this one had found him. True to his word, Turner returned the next day. 4 riders this time: Turner, Henderson from the bank, and the Johnston brothers, local men fallen on hard times who'd developed a reputation for doing unpleasant work for cash. A small crowd had gathered in town after word spread, following the group to Thomas's ranch at a distance. Some came from concern, others from curiosity, but all kept a careful distance that spoke volumes about community courage in hard times. Thomas stood on his porch, neither advancing nor retreating, his stance wide and solid as an oak. Jake and 2 ranch hands flanked him, their loyalty clear, even if their expressions showed concern. Emily remained inside, but Thomas had positioned her near the back door, with a horse saddled and ready if things went badly. Turner dismounted first, his confidence bolstered by the men behind him. "I've been patient, Carter. Now it's time for the girl to come home where she belongs. I have expenses that need seeing to." Henderson from the bank made a point of mentioning Thomas's mortgage was up for review, his eyes never quite meeting Thomas's gaze. "Be sensible, Carter," he said. "In these drought times, nobody can afford to cross the wrong people. The bank has been very understanding about late payments from certain ranchers." The threat wasn't subtle, nor was it meant to be. Thomas noted the faces in the crowd that had gathered at his gate. Folks who'd traded with Thomas for 20 years suddenly found the ground mighty interesting to look at. A few nodded almost imperceptibly, showing silent support, but most simply watched, waiting to see which way the wind would blow before choosing a side. Only Mrs. Gunderson moved to stand beside Thomas, her gray head held high. "Young lady inside is healing just fine without your help, Mr. Turner," she said, her voice carrying to the crowd. "Strange how those accidents you mentioned always leave marks shaped like a man's hands." The Johnston brothers shifted, looking uncomfortable for the first time. Thomas hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, but something in his eyes made Turner hesitate. The battle lines were drawn. The consequences came swift as summer lightning. By week's end, Thomas found himself unwelcome in places he'd done business for decades. At Perkins's general store, Thomas pushed his wagon up to the loading dock as he'd done the first Saturday of every month for 20 years. "Morning, Perkins," he called, handing over his supply list. The storekeeper took the paper with fingers that wouldn't stay still. His eyes darted everywhere but Thomas's face. "Sorry, Thomas. Feed you ordered is out of stock." Thomas glanced at the clearly visible sacks stacked against the wall. "Those look like feed sacks to me." "Them's spoken for. Henderson from the bank was in yesterday. Said there might be supply problems for certain customers." Thomas didn't argue. No point putting Perkins in a tighter spot. The man had 5 children to feed. "I see. Well, I'll take what you can spare." The list came back with most items crossed out. No feed, no coffee, no flour. Just salt and a few canning jars Mrs. Gunderson had ordered special. Thomas thanked Perkins for his time, his voice even, then drove the wagon to the next town over without complaint, adding 3 hours to an already long day. Back at the ranch, Jake was waiting. Thomas explained the situation as they unloaded the meager supplies. "Bank's making sure folks understand the cost of crossing them. Won't be the last of it." Jake said nothing about the reduced rations, just nodded when Thomas explained the situation and showed up for work an hour earlier the next day. The letter from the bank arrived Monday, loan terms adjusted due to changing economic conditions. The new interest rate would double Thomas's payment. Emily watched from the kitchen doorway as Thomas read the letter, her thin frame tense with guilt. "I should go," she said quietly. "This is because of me." Thomas folded the letter carefully, his weathered hands steady. "This isn't your doing. Men like Turner and Henderson, they've been squeezing folks like me for years. You're just their excuse this time. But your ranch, been through drought, blizzards, and grasshoppers, will weather bankers too." Thomas's tone made it clear the subject was closed. That night, Thomas reduced everyone's pay, including his own, by half. The hands gathered in the bunkhouse while he explained. When he finished, he asked if anyone needed to seek work elsewhere. Not a single man stood up. The lamp burned low in Thomas's study as he reviewed the account books. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkened ranch. The night had turned cold, autumn arriving early after the drought summer. The ledger didn't lie. 2 months, maybe 3 if they stretched everything thin, before the money ran out completely. The bank would foreclose by Christmas unless something changed. Thomas rubbed his eyes, feeling every one of his 58 years. The weight of responsibility for his hands, for Mrs. Gunderson, for the girl, it pressed down heavier than the mountains on the horizon. His gaze drifted to the small daguerreotype on his desk, his father standing proud beside a much younger Thomas. 28 years gone now, but Thomas could still hear his voice. Son, a man who bends his principles to save his possessions ends up losing both. His daddy had stood alone once, lost everything but his self-respect. Thomas wondered if he had that same kind of steel. Back in '53, his father had refused to sell their family land in Missouri to the railroad men. They'd burned the barn, poisoned the well. Neighbors turned away, afraid of sharing their fate. A soft cry broke his thoughts. Emily having another nightmare. The girl hadn't slept through the night since arriving. Mrs. Gunderson said it would take time, that wounds of the spirit healed slower than those of the body. Thomas closed the ledger and moved to the window. The ranch lay peaceful under starlight. Barn, corrals, bunkhouse, the garden. Mrs. Gunderson tended so carefully. 30 years of work spread before him, everything he'd built from nothing. All of it balanced against one girl's life and his own soul. From the barn came the soft nickering of horses, life continuing its ordinary miracles despite human troubles. Thomas thought of Turner, of the banker Henderson, of neighbors who looked away rather than stand for what was right. Then he thought of Jake and the hands who stayed despite reduced pay, of Doc Williams, who treated Emily without charging, of Mrs. Gunderson, who mothered the girl as if she were her own. "Lord," he whispered to the darkness, "I'm not asking for easy, just for strength to do what's right." Thomas woke before dawn to the sound of wagon wheels, then silence. No knock followed, no call of greeting. Cautious, he took his rifle and stepped onto the porch. No one was there, but at the gate sat burlap sacks, flour, coffee, sugar, and salt, enough to feed his people for 2 weeks. No note came with the sacks of flour and coffee, just goods left before dawn by someone who didn't want thanks. Thomas stood a long moment, feeling something loosen in his chest. Someone in Willow Creek still remembered what neighbors meant. Later that morning, Doc Williams rode up, medical bag in hand. "Thought I'd check on the girl," he said, dismounting. "Professional duty." They both knew Turner had warned the doctor against helping Thomas. "She's mending," Thomas said, "but I appreciate the visit. Not sure I can pay you just now." Doc Williams waved away his words. Some things matter more than money. He left his bill unmarked. As the doctor examined Emily, Thomas found a letter mixed with the morning's eggs. Jake must have slipped it in. The envelope bore a Kansas City postmark from his old Army friend Simmons. "Word travels even to Missouri," the letter read. "Any man standing against the kind of meanness you describe has my support. Enclosed, find enough to cover 3 months of your loan. It's not charity. It's an investment in the kind of world I want my grandchildren to inherit. Stand firm, old friend." Inside was a bank draft that would cover the next payment with money to spare. That evening, Thomas found Emily in the barn, awkwardly attempting to help with the evening feeding. Her movements were hesitant, unpracticed, a city girl learning country ways. A young calf, barely weaned, pushed its wet nose against her hand, making her jump. Then the animal licked her fingers, tickling her palm. Emily laughed, a sound so unexpected that Thomas had to turn away to hide his emotion. It was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, a tiny crack in the wall of fear she'd built around herself. "He likes you," Thomas said, when he could trust his voice. "He's just hungry," Emily replied, but her fingers gently stroked the calf's ear. Small miracles, Thomas thought. Sometimes that's all a man needs to keep going. The knock came mid-morning, firm but not demanding. Thomas opened the door to find Minister Wilson on his porch, Bible tucked under one arm, his expression resolute beneath his gray beard. "Brother Thomas," he said, removing his hat. "Might I have a word?" Thomas stepped aside to let the older man enter. The minister's white collar stood stark against his black coat, a reminder of his position in the community. Thomas offered the man his best chair and last bit of good coffee without mentioning their scarcity. "Didn't expect to see you out this way, minister," Thomas said, pouring the coffee. "Heard the church board wasn't too pleased with folks who'd crossed the bank." Minister Wilson's weathered face creased with a wry smile. Been preaching 37 years, Thomas. Reckon I've disappointed that board more times than I can count. He took a sip of coffee, savoring it like the luxury it had become. Truth is, I've been too quiet on this matter. The good book's pretty clear about protecting the innocent. Thomas settled into the chair opposite, feeling a burden ease slightly just from having another man acknowledge the rightness of his stand. 3 families left services last Sunday when I mentioned our Christian duty to the vulnerable, Wilson continued. But 14 stayed, and that's something. He leaned forward, lowering his voice though they were alone. Turner's getting desperate. Word is, he owes money to men in Denver who don't forgive debts. He's promised them the girl can earn her keep. Thomas's knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. He'll have to go through me first. That's his plan, son. He's bringing in outside men next time, not just the Johnston brothers. Armed men who don't know you and won't care what you've built here. From the doorway came Emily's voice, quiet but steady. I should go with him, before more people get hurt. Both men turned to see her standing there, thin but straighter than she'd been days before, a new resolve in her posture. No, Thomas said simply. That's not happening. Minister Wilson stood, placing his Bible on the table between them. That's why I'm here. You're not alone in this stand, Thomas. Doc Williams, Widow Jenkins, even old Mrs. Whitaker, they're all asking what can be done. He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. We took up a collection. It's not much, but it'll help with supplies. Thomas looked at the envelope without taking it. I can't accept. It's not for you, Wilson interrupted. It's for her, for the principle of the thing, for what kind of community we aim to be. Thomas's throat tightened. He'd expected to stand alone. There's more, Wilson added. Sheriff Hawkins sent word. He can't openly defy the bank, but he wanted you to know. Turner's planning to move tomorrow, at dawn. As evening approached, riders arrived at the Carter Ranch singly and in pairs, not many, but more than Thomas had dared hope. They gathered in the barn where lantern light wouldn't be visible from the road, their breath clouding in the autumn chill. Jenkins, whose place bordered Thomas's to the north, was the first to speak after introductions were made. My barn's got stone walls, built it that way after the '72 fire. Clear sight lines to the road, too. Could be a fallback position if things go wrong here. Thomas nodded, grateful. Appreciate that, Jenkins. Sheriff Hawkins arrived last, without his badge. His meaning was clear. He was here as Bill Hawkins, not as the law. Turner's bringing 7 men, he said without preamble. 2 local, 5 from Denver, all armed from what I hear. Jake, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. Begging your pardon, but there's something you all should know. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing burn scars similar to Emily's. My stepfather was cut from the same cloth as Turner. I know the kind of man we're dealing with. The revelation shifted something in the room. This wasn't just about one girl anymore. What's your stake in this, Mrs. Whitaker? Thomas asked the elderly widow who sat primly on a hay bale, looking out of place in her neat dress. Mrs. Whitaker, 70 if she was a day, simply said, I'll bring my husband's old Sharps rifle, can still hit a can at 50 yards. She adjusted her spectacles. My Elijah believed that evil prospers when good folks do nothing. Been 30 years since I buried him, but I still aim to make him proud. Doc Williams cleared his throat. I'll have my buggy ready for anyone who needs medical attention. And before you ask, yes, that includes Turner and his men. Taking a stand doesn't mean abandoning our humanity. Thomas listened more than spoke, understanding that this was no longer just his stand, but the community finding its conscience. Each person contributed what they could. Jenkins, his stone barn; Jake, his knowledge of men like Turner; Minister Wilson, his moral authority; Doc Williams, his medical skills. When it came time to make plans, Thomas found himself naturally at the center, not because he demanded leadership, but because they looked to him for it. "We'll station people here, here, and here," he said, sketching positions in the dirt floor. "Nobody shoots first. We show strength, not aggression." Sheriff Hawkins nodded approval. "Turner's kind backs down when the odds aren't stacked their way. If he sees enough of us standing together, he might just decide Emily isn't worth the trouble." "And if he doesn't?" someone asked. Thomas met each person's eyes in turn. "Then we do what's necessary. But we do it right." Dawn was still an hour away when Thomas sat with Emily at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, Mrs. Gunderson having gone to stay with her sister in town. A simple breakfast of biscuits and coffee sat before them, neither eating much. "You should be with the others," Emily said, breaking the silence. "They need you more than I do." Thomas shook his head. "Jake knows what to do. Everyone's in position." He studied her in the lamplight. In the 3 weeks since he'd found her by the creek, she'd changed. Still thin, still haunted, but something had straightened in her spine, cleared in her eyes. Thomas noticed Emily had arranged the cabin with escape routes clear, plates and cups already packed away, the habits of someone used to preparing for trouble. "Been meaning to ask," he said casually, "what you plan to do after all this is settled." She looked up, surprised. The question of after wasn't one she'd considered. I don't know. "Find work somewhere, I suppose, in a different town." Thomas nodded. "Or you could stay here. Ranch always needs an extra pair of hands." Emily stared at him, searching for hidden meaning. Finding none, she swallowed hard. "Why would you want me to stay? I've brought nothing but trouble." "Trouble was already here," Thomas said. "Drought, banks, men like Turner. They've been squeezing folks like us long before you came along." He paused. "Besides, Mrs. Gunderson's taken a shine to you, says you have a good head for figures." A ghost of a smile touched Emily's lips. "I was good at arithmetic in school." "My daddy used to say, 'Courage ain't about not being scared,'" Thomas said, changing direction. "It's about doing what's right even when you're shaking in your boots." Emily nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for more words. Thomas rose to check the window. Morning light filtered through the pines, painting the world gold for a moment. Same sun that had risen over this land before any of them were born, and would continue long after. "Whatever happens," he said, "I want you to know something. This stand, it wasn't just for you. It was for what's right, for what kind of men we choose to be." Emily brushed crumbs from the table with careful precision. "I never thought anyone would." She couldn't finish. "I know," Thomas said simply. They sat in companionable silence as the light grew, waiting for whatever the day would bring. They came with the rising sun at their backs, 7 riders emerging from the morning mist like specters. Thomas stood on his porch, watching their approach through the golden haze of dawn. The dew-dampened grass muffled the horses' hooves until they reached the packed dirt of the yard. 7 riders, 5 strangers, with the hard eyes of men who hired out their guns without asking questions. Turner rode at the front, Henderson from the bank slightly behind him. The other 5 were unknown to Thomas, city men with worn pistols and calculating expressions. Behind Thomas, the house stood quiet. Emily was inside with Mrs. Gunderson, both women armed with Thomas's old shotgun. To casual observation, the ranch appeared nearly deserted, but Thomas knew better. In the barn, the bunkhouse, behind the corral, his allies waited, out of sight, but ready. Thomas stood alone on his porch steps, unarmed, but for the rifle leaning against the wall behind him, visible but not in hand. His stance was relaxed but alert, a man prepared for whatever might come. Turner reined in 20 yards from the porch, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to feel safe. "Thought you might have run, Carter," he called, his voice carrying in the morning stillness. "Would have been the smart play." Thomas didn't respond immediately, his silence a calculated thing. He studied the men behind Turner, noting their positions, their weapons, the way they scanned the property. Professional gunmen, not just local toughs. "Mr. Turner," Thomas finally acknowledged with a slight nod, "seems you've brought quite a committee to discuss one girl." Turner's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Last chance to do this easy, Carter. Girl comes with us. You keep your ranch. Simple as that." "And if I decline your generous offer?" Thomas's tone remained even, conversational. Henderson from the bank shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Be reasonable, Carter. The terms of your loan have been legally adjusted. You're 3 days past due on your payment." "Funny timing on that adjustment," Thomas observed. "Almost like someone's using the bank to fight personal battles." One of the strangers, a lean man with a pockmarked face, spoke up. "We ain't here for conversation. Get the girl, or we burn this place to the ground." Turner shot the man an irritated glance. The threat had been made too early, revealing their intentions. Thomas's expression didn't change. "That how law works in Denver? Burning folks out when they stand their ground?" "Law's what men with guns say it is," the pockmarked man replied. "Always has been." Thomas shook his head slightly. "Not in Willow Creek." As if on cue, Jake stepped out of the barn, rifle held casually but ready. From behind the corral, Jenkins appeared with his shotgun. 2 more men emerged from the bunkhouse. Turner's confident expression faltered slightly. He'd expected Thomas alone, not prepared resistance. "How many men you paying, Turner?" Thomas asked quietly. "Enough to die for someone else's fight?" The gunmen exchanged glances, recalculating the odds. They'd been told this would be easy. One stubborn old rancher, not an organized defense. Turner's face darkened with anger. "This changes nothing. You're still outnumbered, still outgunned." "Maybe," Thomas acknowledged, "but we're fighting for our home." "What are your men fighting for? Your debts?" The first test of wills had begun. For a long moment no one moved. The morning breeze carried the scent of sage and dust across the yard, rippling through the tall grass beyond the fence line. A hawk circled overhead, indifferent to the human drama below. Turner broke the silence. "Henderson, you're the legal man here. Tell Carter what happens when he interferes with a guardian's legal rights." The banker cleared his throat, his authority bolstered by the armed men around him. "Territorial statute is clear, Carter. A guardian has full legal authority until the ward reaches 21 years or enters into marriage. Interference is a criminal offense." "And beating a girl half to death?" Thomas interrupted. "What's the statute say about that?" Henderson looked away, unable to meet Thomas's steady gaze. "Enough talk," Turner snapped. He turned to his hired men. "Search the house. Bring the girl out." 2 of the gunmen dismounted, hands resting on their pistols. As they approached the porch, Thomas straightened to his full height. "That's far enough." The men hesitated, looking to Turner for direction. "Move him," Turner ordered. The pockmarked man drew his pistol. "Step aside, old man." Thomas moved with the economy of a man who'd broken wild horses and faced down rustlers. no wasted motion as he positioned himself between the gunmen and the door. "No." When Jack's man drew first, Thomas didn't flinch, his voice steady as he said, "You might get me, but you'll answer to a whole lot more than just me." From the corner of his eye, Thomas saw movement. Mrs. Whitaker, emerging from behind the woodpile, her dead husband's rifle aimed with the steadiness of decades of practice. Minister Wilson stepped out from behind the well house, shotgun in hand. Doc Williams appeared at the edge of the property, 6 townspeople behind him. Like shadows becoming solid, townspeople appeared from behind buildings and fences, ordinary folks holding pitchforks and hunting rifles, faces set with the determination of people who'd finally chosen their line in the sand. The gunman's eyes widened at the sudden appearance of 24 armed citizens. "Turner, you said this would be simple," he hissed. "You didn't say anything about taking on a whole town." Turner's face contorted with rage. "They're bluffing. These are farmers, not gunfighters." The door to the house opened, and Emily stepped onto the porch. Her face was pale but determined as she stood beside Thomas. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice carrying across the yard, "I'm not going back. Not ever." Turner's control snapped. He drew his own pistol and fired, the shot going wild as his horse shied at the sudden sound. The bullet splintered wood beside Thomas's head. Chaos erupted. Gunmen scrambled for cover as Thomas pulled Emily down behind the porch railing. Jake and the ranch hands returned fire, pinning Turner's men behind their horses. "Get back inside," Thomas shouted to Emily, but she held her ground. "No," she said, "I'm done hiding." A rider appeared on the road, Sheriff Hawkins, wearing his badge again, with a dozen deputized townsmen behind him. His voice cut through the gunfire. "That's enough." The shooting stopped, sudden silence falling across the ranch yard. Sheriff Hawkins rode forward, his star catching the morning light. "Turner, your men just fired first on unarmed citizens. Drop your weapons or face the consequences." Turner's face twisted with desperate calculation. In one fluid motion, he swung his pistol toward Emily. "If I can't have what's mine, nobody will." Thomas lunged, covering Emily with his body as the shot rang out. But it was Turner who fell, a look of surprise on his face as he toppled from his saddle. Behind him, Mrs. Whitaker lowered her husband's Sharps rifle, a thin trail of smoke curling from the barrel. "Elijah always said I was a better shot than him," she remarked to no one in particular. The remaining gunmen raised their hands, the fight gone out of them. The chaos of the morning gave way to the orderly process of justice. Sheriff Hawkins had Turner's surviving men disarmed and lined up against the corral fence, while Doc Williams tended to the wounded, 2 of Turner's gunmen with minor injuries, and Thomas with a graze along his ribs where Turner's bullet had caught him. Henderson from the bank stood awkwardly to one side, his alliance with Turner now a visible liability, as neighbors he'd known for decades watched him with undisguised contempt. Sheriff Hawkins approached Turner's body, kneeling to confirm what everyone already knew. He stood and addressed the gathered townspeople. "Jack Turner died attempting murder in front of 24 witnesses," he announced. Mrs. Whitaker acted in defense of others, as the law allows. The elderly woman nodded once, her duty discharged. Minister Wilson stood beside her, a steadying hand on her shoulder. Hawkins turned to the hired gunman. "As for the rest of you, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, and assault." He began reading the charges formal-like, each word carrying the weight of law finally aligned with what was right. Thomas offered no comment beyond a simple nod to the sheriff. Revenge wasn't his purpose, just protection. The blood seeping through his shirt seemed a small price for the outcome. Emily remained close to his side, her expression a complex mixture of relief and lingering fear. When she spoke, Her voice was quiet, but steady. "Is it really over?" Thomas nodded. "Turner can't hurt you anymore." Henderson approached hesitantly, hat in hands. "Carter, about the loan adjustment." "Save it," Thomas interrupted. "We'll discuss terms next week once the dust settles." The banker nodded, understanding the shifting power dynamics. With the community united against the bank's tactics, his position had weakened considerably. As the sheriff led the prisoners away, folks who'd been avoiding Thomas's gaze for weeks now stepped forward to stand beside him, the invisible lines of allegiance redrawn in the dust of his front yard. Neighbors who'd looked away at the general store now offered handshakes and quiet words of support. Minister Wilson stepped forward, addressing the gathered community. "Today, we remembered what kind of people we choose to be, not just as individuals, but as a town." Mrs. Gunderson emerged from the house with coffee for the neighbors who'd stood with Thomas. The mood shifted from tense to quietly celebratory, not joy at a man's death, but relief at justice served and community restored. Thomas watched it all with quiet satisfaction. The cost had been high, but some things were worth any price. The territorial courthouse in Carson City stood imposing against the autumn sky, its brick facade and white columns, a statement of law's permanence in a frontier still finding its shape. Thomas and Emily descended the steps together, their testimony complete after 3 grueling days. "You did well in there," Thomas said quietly as they reached the street. Emily nodded, her new dress, sewn by Mrs. Gunderson for the occasion, rustling as she walked. "Judge seemed fair." "Judge Harmon's known for being tough but decent," Thomas replied. 15 years for attempted murder and conspiracy, harsh enough to show justice, merciful enough to show civilization. The hired gunmen had received lesser sentences, their cooperation in testifying against Turner's network of creditors in Denver earning them some leniency. Turner himself had been buried in the Willow Creek Cemetery, Mississippi. Whitaker insisting on paying for a proper plot despite what he'd done. Christian charity, she'd called it, though Thomas suspected it was more about closing a chapter than forgiveness. As they reached the wagon for the long ride home, they found it loaded with supplies they hadn't purchased: flour, coffee, tools, even a bolt of calico fabric. "From the Jenkinses and Wilsons," read the attached note, "for the journey home." The ride back to Willow Creek revealed further changes. Neighbors who'd once looked away now waved from their fields. At the general store, Perkins hurried out to help unload, his earlier nervousness replaced with genuine welcome. "Got that feed you wanted, Thomas. Prime quality, set aside special." Even Henderson from the bank appeared, hat in hand, as they neared the ranch. "Carter," he began awkwardly, "in light of changing circumstances, the board has voted to extend your loan at the previous rate and to waive the late fees." Thomas accepted the news with a nod, understanding the unspoken message. The community had shown its power, and the bank had chosen wisely to acknowledge it. Not everyone had changed, of course. Some townspeople still crossed the street when they saw Thomas coming, uncomfortable with having chosen the wrong side. But even this felt like progress, the lines drawn clearer now between what people stood for and against. Back at the ranch, Thomas found his hands had maintained everything in good order during his absence. Jake had stepped up as foreman, showing leadership Thomas hadn't fully recognized before. Thomas accepted help now, without pride or shame, understanding that community meant carrying each other through hard times. The isolation of the testing time was past, replaced by something stronger forged in its crucible. Winter settled over the ranch, snowdrifts piling against fences and outbuildings. Inside the main house, warmth spread from the kitchen, where Emily had taken over much of the cooking, freeing Mrs. Gunderson for other tasks. Thomas paused in the doorway, watching Emily roll out dough with practiced movements that would have been impossible months earlier. She hummed softly as she worked, a habit that had emerged as the nightmares grew less frequent. Thomas noticed Emily no longer flinched at sudden movements, her eyes meeting others directly now. The transformation wasn't complete. Sometimes she still went quiet when memories surfaced, but the change was undeniable. "Smells good," Thomas commented, stepping into the kitchen. Emily glanced up with a small smile. "Mrs. Gunderson's recipe. She says even you can't ruin a pie if the crust is right." "Woman's got a point," Thomas agreed, settling at the kitchen table. It was Sunday afternoon, the one time he allowed himself to rest properly. Emily placed the crust in a pie tin, crimping the edges with careful attention. Her hands, once thin and trembling, had grown steadier, stronger from ranch work. "Been meaning to talk to you about something," Thomas said, his tone casual, though he'd rehearsed this conversation for days. "Spring's coming in a few months. You've been here near half a year now." Emily's fingers stilled on the dough. Do you need me to leave?" "Just the opposite," Thomas replied. "Thought we might make things more official." He reached into his pocket and produced a folded document. "Talked to Judge Harmon while we were in Carson City. He drew up guardianship papers. Legal ones." Emily stared at the document, uncomprehending. "Don't much hold with fancy speeches," Thomas continued. "But I want you to know you've got a home here long as you want it, not as help, but as family." He laid the papers on the table. "You're 17 now. These would make me your legal guardian until you turn 21 or decide to marry. After that, your life's your own, but you'd always have a place here." Emily didn't cry. She'd learned early that tears didn't help, but her hand steadied on the rolling pin, and something in her posture shifted from temporary to permanent. "I don't know what to say," she managed finally. Thomas shrugged. "Don't need to say anything. Think on it if you want." Emily picked up the papers, reading carefully. "I don't need to think," she said quietly. This is home now." Thomas nodded once, emotion making further words unnecessary. Some bonds, he reflected, ran deeper than blood. Sunday service at Willow Creek's white clapboard church had always marked the community's rhythm, but this particular Sunday held special significance. 6 months after the confrontation at the Carter Ranch, the town gathered to celebrate both Easter and the first substantial rainfall after a punishing drought. Thomas sat in his usual pew, Emily beside him in a new dress sewn from the calico fabric neighbors had gifted. Mrs. Gunderson sat on Emily's other side, her weathered face serene. Minister Wilson stood at the pulpit, his sermon touching on renewal without directly mentioning recent events. Yet everyone understood the subtext as he spoke of communities finding their moral compass through trial. "Sometimes the greatest test of faith isn't believing in what we cannot see," he said, his voice carrying to the back pews, "but standing firm for what we can plainly see is right, even when it comes at great cost." Thomas glanced around the small church. Folks who'd stood on opposite sides now shared pews and hymn books, the recent storm having cleared the air rather than destroyed. Sheriff Hawkins nodded from across the aisle. The respect between them deepened since the day he'd chosen to wear his badge again. Young Sam Jenkins watched Thomas with undisguised admiration, the boy learning without being taught what it meant to be a man of principle. His father had explained to the boy how Thomas had stood against powerful forces rather than compromise what was right. Outside the church windows, rain clouds gathered on the horizon, promising relief to the parched land. might not solve every problem, but it was a start, just like the healing that had begun in Willow Creek. As the congregation rose to sing the final hymn, Thomas felt Emily's shoulder brush against his arm, no longer flinching from human contact. They stood together, part of something larger than themselves, a family formed by choice rather than chance, a community that had remembered what it meant to stand together. The drought was ending. Spring had come to Willow Creek in more ways than one. You know, my granddaddy used to say that the true measure of any community ain't how they act in good times, but what they do when the weather turns. Willow Creek faced their storm that spring, not just the drought that threatened their livestock, but the kind of moral drought that can parch a community's soul. Thomas Carter wasn't looking to be a hero or teach anybody a lesson. He was just a man who knew the difference between what's easy and what's right, and found he couldn't live with himself choosing wrong. Reminds me of those men from our father's generation who came back from World War II and Korea, the ones who never talked much about what they'd done, but whose quiet strength shaped the communities where we grew up. What struck me most about Thomas wasn't just his stand against Turner, but how he recognized that true strength isn't about standing alone. It's about standing firm long enough for others to find their courage, says Whitaker with her dead husband's rifle, Minister Wilson risking his position, Doc Williams treating everyone regardless of which side they stood on. Each one chose a harder path when an easier one was available. I've seen that same choice in my own life, times when doing what's right cost something real. Maybe you have too. That moment when you realize nobody would blame you for walking away, but something deeper than pride won't let you. And in standing firm, Thomas reminded folks that we're all responsible for the kind of community we build together. That's something worth remembering in any time, that one person standing up can sometimes help others find their feet too. The rain clouds that gathered over Willow Creek that Easter Sunday weren't just bringing relief to parched land. They were washing away the kind of fear that lets good people look the other way when they know better. Sometimes that's all it takes to heal a community's soul, one person willing to get wet first.